Hello everyone, I'm Saurabh and I welcome you back to the Digital Board series by Orchids Biosciences. This is the second video of the chapter, that is Control and Coordination. If you haven't watched the first video yet, I have provided its link in the description below, so please do watch it. In this video, we will discuss about the nervous system in human beings and its components, which involve the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Then, at the end of the video, we will also discuss how these nervous tissues cause action in our body. So let's start with nervous system. The nervous system in human beings is divided into two parts, the central nervous system or CNS and the peripheral nervous system or the PNS. The central nervous system comprises of the brain and the spinal cord. So these two parts, the brain and the spinal cord, forms the central nervous system, whereas the nervous system which is arising from this brain and the spinal cord and connects to all the parts of the body forms the peripheral nervous system or PNS. So PNS or peripheral nervous system is a connection between the central nervous system and all the parts of the body. First, let us discuss about the central nervous system or the CNS. The central nervous system's first part is brain. So where is this brain located? The brain is located in the cranium, and cranium is the uppermost part of our skull. And the brain is protected by three layers, and these layers are called as meninges. Further, in between these meninges or in between these layers, there is a fluid filled, and this fluid is called as cerebrospinal fluid. This cerebrospinal fluid acts as a shock absorber and protects the brain from any kind of external damage. Now, let us discuss the parts and the structure of our brain. The brain can be divided into three major parts. They are the front part or the forebrain, the middle part or the midbrain, and the back part of the brain or the hindbrain. So the brain as a whole can be divided into three parts: forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. First, let us see what are the parts in the brain and then try to figure out which part comes under the forebrain, which parts make the midbrain, and which parts make the hindbrain. The very first part of the brain and the largest part of the brain is cerebrum. The cerebrum occupies the most of the area of the brain and it is highly folded. It is highly folded so that it can have more surface area. And if it has more surface area, more number of neurons can be accommodated. So therefore, the cerebrum is highly folded to increase the surface area to accommodate more number of neurons. If you look at the cerebrum from a top view, the cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres, the left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere. And each hemisphere is further divided into various lobes, and each lobe has its own specific function. So let us take one cerebral hemisphere and see what are the lobes in it. Each cerebral hemisphere is divided into four lobes: the frontal or the front lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobe constitute the cerebral hemisphere. So this is in one cerebral hemisphere. On the other side, the other cerebral hemisphere also have the same number of lobes. And each of this lobe have its own specific function. For example, the frontal lobe is associated with high order thinking. For example, if we need to solve a problem or we need to remember something, so in that time, the frontal lobe is responsible for doing all these functions. Whereas the other lobes have different function. The parietal lobe is responsible for sensing the sensory information. For example, the sense of taste, temperature, touch. So all this sensory information will be processed by the parietal lobe. Then what is the function of occipital and temporal lobe? The occipital lobe is responsible for the visual reception, or simply I can say sight. So for sight, the occipital lobe is responsible, whereas the temporal lobe is responsible or associated with the auditory reception or hearing. So we can see the frontal lobe is responsible for higher order thinking, like remembering certain things or solving a problem, whereas the other three lobes are associated with some sense. Parietal lobe is for processing sensory information like taste, temperature, touch, occipital with the sense of sight, and temporal with the sense of hearing. So these are the four lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. So those were the parts of the cerebrum. Now let us discuss the other parts of the brain. After the cerebrum, there is thalamus and hypothalamus. The thalamus is responsible for relaying the sensory information from the sense organs to the brain. So it acts as a connection between the sense organ and brain because it relays the information from the sense organ to brain. Coming to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is responsible for maintaining the homeostasis. What is this homeostasis? Homeostasis is maintaining an internal balance of the body or maintaining a stability of the body. So hypothalamus is responsible for doing this process. It not only is responsible for homeostasis, it is also responsible for controlling our sleep cycle and our emotions. So we can see that thalamus and hypothalamus are having different functions. Thalamus relays the information from sense organ to brain, whereas the hypothalamus is responsible for homeostasis, sleep cycle and emotions. The thalamus and hypothalamus are the parts of diencephalon. So what are the parts of forebrain? They constitute cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain, and the diencephalon. So after the forebrain, let us move on to the midbrain. Midbrain is present below the diencephalon, and midbrain has a different function. The midbrain is responsible for receiving the auditory and visual stimulus. Auditory is related to the hearing and visual is related to the sight. So it receives the stimulus of hearing and sight, and in response it gives some reflex movements. So we can say the midbrain is responsible for processing the auditory and the visual stimulus and respond to it. Moving on from the midbrain to the last part of the brain, that is hindbrain. The hindbrain is made up of three parts: the pons, cerebellum and the medulla oblongata. And these three parts form the hindbrain. Pons is responsible for some aspects of respiration. The cerebellum is important to maintain the body posture, whereas the medulla oblongata is a connecting link between the brain and the spinal cord, because followed by the medulla oblongata, it is connected to the spinal cord. So it is a connection between the brain and the spinal cord. And medulla oblongata is also responsible for other functions like respiration, heartbeat and blood pressure. So this pons, which is responsible for some aspect of respiration, cerebellum, which maintains our body posture, and medulla oblongata, which is connecting the brain to the spinal cord, forms the hindbrain. So we have seen the forebrain consists of the cerebrum and diencephalon, then the midbrain, which is present below the diencephalon, and finally the hindbrain, which is made up of the pons, cerebellum and medulla oblongata. So these are the major parts of the brain. After the brain, let us discuss about the second part of the central nervous system, that is spinal cord. We know that spinal cord originates from the medulla oblongata and runs throughout our vertebral column. So the spinal cord is protected in our vertebral column, or also called as a backbone. We have also discussed about the importance of spinal cord in the process of reflex action, which is a spontaneous action or a response which is given by the spinal cord itself. It does not wait for the brain to respond, whereas the spinal cord itself tells us what to do in response to the external stimuli. So when we look into the function of spinal cord, the first function is it conducts the impulses. What are these impulses? The sensory impulse and the motor impulses. So it conducts these impulses from and to the brain. The second important function of spinal cord is it acts as a control center, or it acts as a major center for the process of reflex action. In reflex action, the spinal cord itself tells us what to do in response to the external stimuli. It does not wait for the brain to respond to it. So its function involves conducting the impulses from and to the brain, and it acts as a major site for reflex action. So this is about the spinal cord. With that, we come to the end of central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. Now let us move on to the next part of our nervous system, that is peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, which is also known as PNS, can be divided into two parts. One is called as the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Now, what is the somatic and autonomic nervous system? There are various activities in our body which can be controlled by our own will. So, activities which can be controlled by our will comes under somatic nervous system. For example, if we want to move a chair, so it is depending upon us whether we want to move the chair or not. So it is completely controlled by our will. If we want to move the chair, we will move. If we do not want to move, we will not move. So it is controlled by our own will. Whereas there is another nervous system under the peripheral one, that is autonomic nervous system. Auto means self, which means we cannot control it by our own will. It is completely self-regulated, or it is automated by the peripheral nervous system itself. For example, our heartbeat. We cannot control our heartbeat. It is directly controlled by the peripheral nervous system without our will. So this autonomic nervous system can't be controlled by our will. So the heartbeat or the stomach movement and secretions, this and all we cannot control. So this is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is further bifurcated into two. One is called as sympathetic nervous system and another one is parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system work opposite to each other. For example, if the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for increasing the heart rate, the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for decreasing the heart rate. Let me give you another example. If the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for decreasing the stomach movements and secretions, the parasympathetic will work opposite to it. So if sympathetic is decreasing the secretions, the parasympathetic will increase the stomach secretions and movements. So sympathetic and parasympathetic work opposite to each other in the autonomic nervous system. So far we have seen about the nervous system. Now let us see how these nervous tissues cause the action. We know that these actions or movements in our body are performed by our muscle cells, and the muscle cells are made up of muscle fibers, which are further made up of muscle proteins. The proteins are capable of changing their shape as well as their arrangement. So whenever there is a nerve impulse from the CNS, through the neurons, it will reach the muscle cells. So once the muscle cells receive the information from the CNS that they have to move, the muscle fibers which have the muscle proteins in them will change their shape. How? By changing the shape and the arrangement of the proteins which are present in them. So the proteins which are present in these muscles are responsible for changing the shape of the muscle, due to which we can see some action or movement by our muscles. Now, let us quickly recall what we have discussed in this video. We started with the human nervous system, and we saw it is divided into two categories, the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. In central nervous system, we discussed about brain and spinal cord. Then we saw the parts of the brain. Brain is further divided into forebrain, midbrain and hind brain. Then we saw forebrain is made up of cerebrum and diencephalon. And we also saw the parts of hindbrain, that is pons, medulla oblongata and cerebellum. We also discussed their functions as well. Then we discussed about the spinal cord, where it is located, that is inside the vertebral column, and also its major functions. Then we moved on to the peripheral nervous system. We saw peripheral nervous system is made up of two types of nervous system, the somatic one, which is controlled by us, and the autonomic one, which cannot be controlled by us. Further, the autonomic nervous system was divided into two, that is sympathetic and parasympathetic. And the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system works opposite to each other. Then finally, we also discuss how the nervous tissues cause action by changing the shape of the muscle proteins. So that is about the overview of the nervous system in human beings. With this, we come to the end of nervous system. In the next video, we will discuss about the hormonal system. Hormonal system is seen in case of both plants and animals. So we will be studying the hormones which are present in plants as well as the hormones which are present in animals. With that, we come to the end of this topic, that is nervous system. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you like this video, please hit the like button, share it with your friends, and do not forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel.